So that advice of 20 rep squats and a gallon of milk a day is going to leave you very poorly developed. Okay? Is it a good start? Are there good things about that? Yes. But that is not a program. Okay? I've heard ridiculous things like squats grow your whole body. That's really wrong. If you're wildly untrained, that is true. Right? Maybe. Or if you're like trying to pec fly the bar while you're squatting, I don't know what the hell you're doing. Right? Squats are not going to get you a big upper body. That's just nonsense. So one of the big implications for specificity is whatever muscles you want to grow, you have to train those muscles. Probably directly, probably sometimes with isolation movements. Compound movements have a huge advantage on overload, which is why we're really going to be pushing for them. But there's going to be, if you want to hypertrophy in a certain muscle group, you're going to have to train that muscle group. Right? So specificity instantly refutes all these ideas that you can just train very generally and have the best, most well-developed physique possible. Right? It also refutes a number of other philosophies, or just puts them in their place, like what about being a combination bodybuilder powerlifter? Right? Is that a good idea? It depends on how far you want to go in each sport. Right? If you were the ultimate powerlifter, if you have the potential to be the best in the world, any bodybuilding you do, by definition, interferes with your power. If you want to be the best possible bodybuilder, every time you do powerlifting training, it's a bad idea. Because you should do everything in your training and your life to be specific to the sport of bodybuilding. So specificity allows us to understand that depending on how serious we are about hypertrophy training, every facet of our program has to be geared towards hypertrophy training. If you tell me that you have a hypertrophy program and you're serious about growing muscle size and losing fat, I should be able to point to any part of your plan and ask you how that fits in with hypertrophy. If you don't have an answer, you didn't think it through. Or if you're like, well, that gets me strong. Why? I don't know. One of the specificity considerations here that I still can't figure out is people who focus on strength training for hypertrophy training because they say a stronger muscle can like lift more weight or something. And that's somehow supposed to imply something for hypertrophy. You guys figure that out yet? There's people who do, we do strength cycles in bodybuilding, we get to that phase potentiation, mostly because strength training is a good way to keep our muscle size, and it's lower volume, and allows us to repotentiate for our hypertrophic abilities later. But the act of getting really, really strong, spending a long time in sets of 5 and sets of 3, how does that carry over to bigger muscle? You guys know? Because I fucking don't. The people say, like, they'll give it lip service. They'll be like, well, stronger muscle can lift more weight. And then you can do more damage or something. But if you're weaker, you can probably get a similar effect of hypertrophy on your musculature just by using less weight. Right? So if you were to train someone like Derek Kendall, get him back to bodybuilding, what's his overload threshold now for growing his quads? How much does he have to squat? You guys know who Derek Kendall is? He's an enormous monster. He's like one of the best powerlifters in the world. He's just gigantic. He's front squatted like 350 or something for reps.
This is just a query. But a stronger muscle can then lift more volume and therefore get.
It can.
So wouldn't that then?
I'm asking you if that's true.
If you're stronger, then you'll be able to lift more volume because obviously sets times weight. Although
yeah, but stronger muscles take on more homeostatic damage, right? They can hurt themselves more, and for every rep they hurt themselves more. They also hurt other structures more. So if you're really strong, you're more likely to snap tendons, you're more likely to microfracture bones, you're more likely to take on a lot of central nervous system fatigue. So I don't think it's really true that big, stronger muscles allow you to produce higher volume loads. As a matter of fact, I can get any marathon runner to out total in volume load any bodybuilder any day of the week. And they can do sets of 10 until they just forever. They can do 100 sets of 10 a day and still recover, and their total volume will be higher. How productive is that volume is another question. But I'm not convinced it's the case that as you get stronger, your volume loads increase. I think as your volume loads increase, you get stronger. But I don't know if it works the other way around. Question.
Does that not violate the principle of intensity then?
What do you mean?
So if you take a marathon runner and you can say you can out volume like some of us here, then we're only doing 30% to 40% of the 1 rep max. If you can lift more, then theoretically, if you're working within 60 to 75%, you're actually lifting.
No, I mean they can outlift us 60 to 75%. Like, so if we give a marathon runner 65% of his squat run around, he can do it and not generate any DOMs for like 200, 300, 400 reps in a workout just fine. They can recover unbelievably fast. They have mostly slow twitch muscle fibers. So, whereas if somebody who's really fast, which is really strong, might not even get to the same total volume because they get so damaged so quickly. So getting stronger, I don't think is the best way to be able to train at higher volumes. As a matter of fact, there's a really good way to be able to train at higher volumes. It's training at higher volumes.
Hey, Mike.
Specific, yeah.
Could you expand upon this a little bit? So there's a couple like articles that have been controversial lately about like load not seeming to matter, like how much weight you lift and they have similar effect on hypertrophy.
Yeah, totally. We'll get to that in overload in just a
So I think
second.
that's kind of the underlying question.
Yeah.
that we're getting at.
I don't think it's true that getting stronger allows you to lift more than total volume. So I don't think that's true. I don't know where that came from.
From a practical point, if you're doing, 3 sets of 10, and you're able to lift more load, then your volume will be higher. And I know that you could get a marathon runner to match.
Just do another set of 10.
Really? So if you had like let's just say you were doing 4 sets of 8, right?
Mhm.
And you could do 4 sets of 8 in squats now with 100 kilograms, and then a couple of months later you can do 4 sets of 8 with 120 kilograms. You haven't hypertrophy. You haven't got bigger muscle. Well,
Oh, you probably have. Well,
that's
certainly.
that's not a. You would stick with the weight and just do more and more and more and more. Because that's
No, not necessarily. You will be getting stronger, but you don't want to design your program for the purposes exclusively of neurological strength adaptation. So let's say we say getting strong is really important for size eventually in some way. So we spend years doing 3s and 5s.
Oh no, that's why I use the example of 8, like sets of
Yeah,
of
but
8.
then now we're talking about putting in good quality volume load above the minimum intensity. That is hypertrophy specific training. That's a very good way to train. What I'm talking about is specifically trying to get really strong because you think it's somehow going to carry over beneficially for bodybuilding while you're staying away from actually generating any kind of high volume workout. So what we're saying is like, if you give me a power lifter who's already really, really, really strong and not particularly big, that when they start training for hypertrophy, they're just going to blow up much more than someone who maybe isn't as strong. I'm not sure that that's the case. And as a matter of fact, because they're so strong, they could run into more difficulties rather than benefits. But, I'm not sure that's the case either, but it's by no means clear that getting strong on purpose, aside from bodybuilding, is the greatest idea in the world for hypertrophy. You will be getting strong in the proper repetition range and the proper volume load range, but to abandon ship and decide we're doing 5s and 3s for a real long time because strength is somehow going to carry over to hypertrophy in some magical way, by no means clear that that's the case. Yeah. Go ahead.
Didn't Brad Schoenfeld do a volume equated program looking at 310 versus, 310, but I can't remember the exact numbers. It's a 5x5 program. And as long as it's volume equated, the same effect in terms of hypertrophy you'll see.
Totally.
So you just said 5, but working in rep ranges of 3 to 5 doesn't create hypertrophy.
Yeah, so the amount of fatigue generated by the group that did the lower weight, higher reps was practically unnoticeable. The amount of fatigue generated by the high force, low rep group was mind-boggling. So if you actually equated MRV, then the group that trained in 10s could have done probably 7 or 8 sets of 10 and been as fatigued as the group that did 7 or 8 sets of 3 or
From a long-term perspective.
Yeah, it was actually, did you read the article itself? Or,
I didn't see the article.
yeah, it's right in there. They say that the two groups just fatigue, like one of the people just wanted to give up in the one group. They were like, my entire body's fucked. And the other group, they finished, by the way, a third of the time. Each session took a third of the time as long. They finished and they were like, so what else? And they're like, well, we're done for today. They're like, what? I keep going. They got the same hypertrophy with like a third of the effort and a fraction of the time commitment. So if you actually match up potential to training with high repetitions beats training with low repetitions any day of the week for hypertrophy. It's not even close. Now that study did prove a very already known, but a very important factor is that volume is absolutely king for hypertrophy. Absolutely. And it doesn't really matter how you get there. You'll get the same hypertrophy, but how you get there, how much fatigue you generate along the way tells you how reliable your training program is to actually train at your best. Does that make sense? So if we know volume is king, we have to design a program that allows us to train with the highest possible volumes while still meeting minimum intensity concerns. And then sets of 10, et cetera, sets of 12 probably beat out everything for most cases. And we'll get to that in overload in just a sec. But what we basically, the reason I brought up the strength training thing is bodybuilders will also do, I've seen every now and again people who want to train for hypertrophy do power training, for example. They'll do cleans and they'll say, well, some research shows like high velocity training is really good for muscle size. You know, does velocity increase muscle size? As long as you're training faster than about 8 seconds per rep, which is ridiculous, okay, super slow if you think about it. Hypertrophy is pretty much equivalent to that, right? So doing power training, every now and again you'll get these coaches who sort of do hypertrophy training and they'll like, yeah, we've got some power cleans today to really develop some explosive qualities. And it kind of because we're supposed to like explosive qualities and power is really good. And same thing for strength, that will get you strong because eventually it'll make you bigger. It's up to you guys to be skeptical and ask the question, how the fuck does that happen? Like, so if we've got a bodybuilder that did hang cleans and now he's developed a ton of power, when is he going to win more bodybuilding shows because of that? Seriously. Are power cleans good? Yeah, they're great for power development. But for bodybuilding, we have to be specific. So when you see bodybuilders doing just really bodybuildery shit, and you want to tell them like, hey man, you tried like jerk block, like, you know, like snatches and stuff, like, no, that's fucking stupid. That makes sense? Like, that's a waste of their time. It will get them powerful for sure, but you don't get judged on a stage for power, and certainly don't develop much muscle size from power. Yeah.
So within a hypertrophy block, what do you consider to, like Eric Helms' recommendations, that roughly one third of your volume comes from the 1 to 5, 1 to 6 repetition range, while 2/3 comes from the 6 to 12-ish range? Would you be more focused on hitting the 6 to 12 because it allows greater volume overall?
Yeah, definitely. I don't particularly agree with that recommendation. I think it's mostly unsustainable. If you go into the 1 to 6 rep range often, you'll break in half, especially if you're really strong. Most bodybuilders just don't do that. You see bodybuilders that do a lot of 3RMs and stuff, you'll see them hurt really soon because the volumes they're pushing in the other parts of the workout don't allow you to recover from that sort of thing. I'm not sure it's almost never productive for bodybuilders to train with anything less than 6 repetitions. 5 for sure. You get maximal force muscle fiber recruitment from anything between up to about 8 reps if you're trying really hard, right? And there's no real noticeable difference when you're training less than 5 reps. You're really working on your high force output technique, right? Oh fuck, am I going to squat this, right? You're no longer even overloading much on the force side of the spectrum. You can get just as high forces from slightly lighter weights for higher reps. So I'd say that 1 to 5 rep range I'd probably avoid like crazy. We'll talk about that more in just a second.
Yeah, so like a lot of the thought on the strength training stuff for hypertrophy is flawed for a couple reasons that we've already talked about. The first one, like we already said, fatigue management. So in order to generate the same high volume loads, you have to use a much higher weight with the strength training. And as that paper site that you mentioned, it basically just causes people to break in half. The other problem is because you're training at such high volume loads, now you're not even able to express how much strength you actually have because you're actually taking yourself out of your optimal MRV range for strength, right? So you kind of split the difference and you're getting the worst of both worlds where you're saying, okay, well my training's beating the shit out of me and I'm not getting quite as strong as I could be getting. So generally we recommend you focus on one thing at a time. So if you're doing a hypertrophy block, can you add some strength stuff in there? Yeah, sure, but you're really not focusing on hypertrophy at that point. You're splitting the difference. Does that make sense? So we say don't split the difference, just focus on one at a time. And if you want to work on strength later, great, you just build up all that muscle mass, and Mike's going to talk about phase potentiation, and that's how we kind of see it.
Yeah. Question?
Yeah, do you think there's any benefit for satellite cell proliferation training with higher percentages?
I'm not aware of any research that says that. I'm aware of research that says that you have to do an extraordinary amount of damage and that helps. But the way to do damage is mostly through other ways. If you do insist on training really heavy, you're probably not going to take as much damage because your nervous system is going to give up before your muscles ever do. Your ability to produce those high forces is just going to get crazy fatigue without doing a ton of muscle damage. I mean, how much delayed onset muscle soreness can you tell from sets of 3? Probably none, but you're going to get really, really beat up. So, but maybe, potentially in the future, we would find out that really super high forces lead to more satellite cells, and then you'd see me change my tune really quick. Yeah.
But for strength training specifically, I know we're not really talking about it now, but what if you would do a hypertrophy block? Would you also then just say like stay clear of 85, 90%?
You bet.
Weight? Yeah.
Totally. Most of the best coaches would say that too. Shaco's not having his guys do max singles and then deep in the off season. There's no point. Because remember, what do you get out of really, really heavy work? It's neurological adaptations, right? And you train your nervous system to be really explosive, and then later in the workout you train it to not be really explosive. So what's the net benefit that it gets? Just gets mixed message. And it doesn't get much better, not much of anything, when you're showing off for no reason. You're at your peak to show off, so it doesn't make any sense. So yeah, you should be working through some spectrum of rep ranges, but that spectrum should be relatively clustered. So in any case, specificity, so the big conclusion there is that anytime anyone quotes anything in your program, it had better have something to do with hypertrophy. Now, it doesn't have to do exactly with hypertrophy. It could face potentiate hypertrophy later, set you up for hypertrophy later, but it's got to make sense, right? And of course, body part focus has to make sense. And specificity comes down to, we'll get to this in individual difference, right? And some in variation, look, whatever you want to grow, that's what you should train the most, right? If you have weak legs and a really great upper body, and you really want to bring up your legs, you should probably train your legs a lot and your upper body less, okay? Some of us get carried away with trying to make everything as good as it can be. And that's okay, but you're gonna mess up on some of that symmetry side. Does that make sense? If you really wanna bring something up, you probably have to take something else and put it on the back burner. So specificity, relatively straightforward. I just don't want you guys to get caught up in that voodoo of these little weird little justifications. Like, well, it's good to train for power. It's good for power athletes to train for power, right? Can you imagine going in and working with weightlifters and having them just do a bunch of lateral raises and upright rows because you're like, oh, big shoulders will help you do cleans. Like, man, it just doesn't transfer that directly. And you have to think about, yeah, if they have an infinite MRV, they could just do everything and get better. But they don't. They have to get rested up for their snatches tomorrow, and you're having them do a bunch of lateral raises. Same idea, then weightlifters come to a bodybuilder and say you should do snatches because they're really great for your traps. Like, okay, great. Let's fucking snap my elbow in half trying to do snatches. My traps won't ever grow. Bad idea, right?